Hello everyone, and welcome to a very exciting tutorial. Today we're going to be taking a look at how to create our first Adobe Premiere script. And today we're going to be creating a simple slideshow generator where the user simply selects the image folder they want, selects how long each image should be, and then everything is done automatically for them. So without further ado, let's go ahead and run the script. So before we get started, I should mention that running scripts in Premiere is rather limited right now. There are currently two known ways to actually run your scripts. The first way is to run them directly from Extend Script, which is the method we'll be using, and you can also run them via extensions, which will offer some more UI input for the user. But for the sake of most tutorials on this channel, we're going to be using Extend Script. That way we can just press the play button and it's going to link directly to Premiere. So I have here a blank Premiere project loaded up. Alright, so if we go ahead and run this inside of Premiere, the first step it's going to ask us is to select a folder with all of our images in it. So I'll navigate to my Pictures folder here, and I'll just select this folder called Desktop Backgrounds. Click on OK, and now it's going to ask us how many seconds we want each image in our slideshow to be. Let's just say 6. Click on OK. And now we can go ahead and create a new sequence with whatever dimensions and frame rate we want, and the script is automatically going to generate everything for us. So we'll just say 1080p at 30 frames per second. Click on OK. Now if I go into Premiere, you can see we have a sequence called Your Slideshow, an image folder with all of the images from that Desktop Backgrounds folder, and here's our sequence with our slideshow. So let's take a look. As you can see, we have a nice animating picture that fades, and if we look at the effect controls, you can see we have keyframes on both the scale and opacity. And we just apply the same keyframes to each layer and create a nice simple slideshow. So again, like I said, today we're going to be doing this inside of Extend Script with JavaScript scripting. The total script is around 200 lines of uncommented code, so let's go ahead and get started and dive straight into Adobe Premiere scripting. If you're still a beginner in programming or scripting for Adobe programs, be sure to check out some of the other tutorials on this channel and around the web to make sure you have a basic understanding. Since this script is rather complex, we will be going over some things that are already assumed that you know. So just be sure that you check out some other tutorials, beginners tutorials, and read the documentation. So I'm going to go ahead and open a new file here to get our script started. I'm just going to define a function called main that we're going to run first thing, and this is just going to be where we stuff everything into. One thing to note is that with Adobe Premiere scripting, you do not have the same UI functionality as say with After Effects or Illustrator. So we have to get a little bit creative when asking for inputs from the user and also make more assumptions about what kind of keyframes and time positions they want. So the first thing that we want to do that we did in the script is to import our files into the program. So the last thing I want to say before we get started is if you have any questions or want to get started diving into it yourself, all of the documentation for what's currently available in Premiere scripting is in the Object Model Viewer inside of Extend Script. And if you go down here to Adobe Premiere Pro, either version, there are a few more things inside of 2018 that I like to use, so I stick to the newest version. But you can go through here and check out a lot of the built-in classes and objects that you can get data from and modify to get different ideas for scripting. So the first thing we need to do in our script again is to import all of our files into the project. So let's go ahead and start off by saying we'll make a folder for our import folders. So I'll just say import folder, and we'll say it's equal to a new folder. We don't know the path of this folder yet, so we'll just say it's a new folder. Now we're going to set our import folder to a folder that we want the user to select. There are a couple ways to get the user to select a folder and to open a dialog, but we're just going to use the default way, which is the folder name or the file name .select dialog, and we just want to tell the user to open a folder. Now the difference between folder.select dialog and say file.open dialog, which is abbreviated, the first one is used specifically for folders, and this file.open dialog abbreviated is specifically for opening up files. The two dialog boxes it opens are completely different. The ones for the folder is a little bit more hierarchical and top down, and the open dialog is just the standard OS one that you're used to seeing. So when we run this, it's going to open up just a simple file dialog like this, and we can select a folder. Next up, we need to check if that folder that they just selected exists, because if we run the script and we click on cancel, well, our folder is going to be nothing because they didn't select a folder. So we're going to say if our import folder is equal to null, which means it hasn't been defined yet. Well, we technically defined it up here as a new folder, but it doesn't have any actual value if we press the cancel button. So if it's null, or if the user didn't really select anything when we asked them, we just need to say no folder selected. We'll alert this, and I'll also tell them in the top to please run again. And then I'm going to say return false, which will break out of our main function here, and they'll have to run the script again in this particular case. Next up, we want to create a variable for all of the files we're going to be importing. So I'm going to say files is equal to our import folder, and just for reference, I'm going to load up my desktop backgrounds folder that we're working with. So we need to get all of the files from within here, all 22 of them. To do this, we just have to say our folder and .get files, and it's a method. This is going to return an array of our files. The next thing we want to check is if there's not any files at all in the folder, tell the user to either pick a different folder or add some files to it. So we're going to say if our files.length, or all of the files we just got, let's say in this case we should be getting 22 when we get the length. But if it's less than 1, which means there's no files, then we need to tell the user that no files are detected. And in this case, they need to select a valid folder with files in it, and hopefully they can get it fixed. And this time, instead of just canceling out of our main function and waiting for them to run the script again, what we can do instead of returning false is actually just run our main function again. It's recursion inside of itself, where we go through here. If something's wrong, we should run it again until they can basically get the folder right and make sure it has images and enough of them in it. So after we've checked how many files we have, in fact, we should double check how many files we have. Let's check files.length, and I'll run it. And again, I'll select that desktop backgrounds folder, which should have 22 files in it. And we're actually getting 23, which means that there's a hidden file in here, which is probably generating the thumbnails or something like that. Sometimes on a Mac, you'll have another file built into there. But we'll be setting up the code to ignore anything that's not an image file, so don't worry about that. So after we've checked how many files are in that folder, let's go ahead and get our image files themselves. What I mean by this is to actually get the paths for our image files. Instead of having the file objects themselves, we want to get just the paths, because when we import files, we need to make sure we know where on the computer they're located. So we're going to say our image files is equal to get image paths, and we're going to pass through an argument called files. This is going to be a custom function we're going to work on in a little bit called get image paths, and again we're just passing through all of the files. What this is going to do is take all of the files, hidden or not, inside of our selected folder. We're going to check if they're an image file, and if they are, we want to get the path, push it into a big array, and return it to the image files. So let's go ahead and work on our get image paths function. The first thing in here we're going to define is this name, which is going to be the name of the current file we're going through, and we're also going to have all of our paths that I said we're going to be returning as an array as well. Then we're simply going to loop through all of our files, which start at I equals 0, and we're going to go until files.length and increment by 1. Then for each time through, we're going to say this name is equal to files index I and the name. We're just going to grab the current name of the file, because we need to grab the name to check for an extension like JPEG or PNG. So then after we have our name, we're going to have an if statement, and this is where we check if it's an image. We're going to be using this a couple times throughout the script, so let's go ahead and do it. The first check is if this name.substring, and the substring we're going to be looking at is this name.length minus 3 up to this name.length. What this simply means is, say for example I take this one here, we're going to take the entire length of the file name, go back 1, 2, 3 spots, and cut it from there to the end, which should give us, in this case, just JPEG. But as you can see, some of these are uppercase JPEG and some are lowercase. So we're going to take that whole section of the substring that we just cut out, and we're going to convert it to a lowercase string. And we're going to check if this entire string is equal to JPEG. Now we can just add an OR statement and copy and paste this so we have 3 or however many instances you need. So I'll turn on a word wrap here. We've got JPEG and we need the one with the E, as well as PNG. So now we'll be checking for JPEG, or PNGs. And if this is the case, if the name has this in it, what we want to do is grab our paths, and inside of that we're going to push our files i.fs name. Now the fs name basically has the entire file path plus the file name, which is exactly what we need to import them into Premiere. Now that we've got all of those being pushed into there, we just need to simply return paths. So now if I go up to my image files and I just write the line for our image files, we should just get a list of all of the files from the folder that we selected. So if I go ahead and run this, select my desktop backgrounds, as you can see we get a nice big list of all of our file paths, which basically have the entire path plus the file name. Alright, so back up inside of our main function, below our image files, the next check we want to do is we need to check if there are no image files. What if there's a bunch of files in this folder, but they're all videos or something else? Well, what we can do is grab our image files array. Actually, we'll check it. So we'll say if our image files dot length is less than 1. So just like our files length, but this time we're specifically checking if they're image files, not if there's any files at all. So if there's no images in that folder, we just need to tell the user no images or no image files in this folder. And then this time we're going to do the same thing where instead of returning false, we just run the main function again and have them reselect a different folder. Alright, so that sort of deals with all of the setup and nitty-gritty stuff to make sure we have all of the information and data we need to make this slideshow work properly. Alright, so next up, after the user selects a folder, what was the next step in the process? Well, that was to have them input how many seconds for each image in this slideshow. The way we get around this, because there's not really any UI options directly built into Premiere scripting, is to use a prompt. So I'm going to set a variable called seconds equal to a prompt. Now a prompt is simply a little dialog that pops up with 3 pieces of text. So we'll have 3 arguments here. The first one will say seconds per image. So this is the text it displays to the user. The next text is the default text it will display in the box. So we'll say 5 seconds is the default. And then lastly, we're just going to leave it blank. So now if I go ahead and display our seconds and run the script, select my folder, and you can see we now have our prompt. So if we change the third string of text, it would change what the script prompt is. Otherwise, we have seconds per image and the number. Click on OK, and as you can see, we get 5 because the user inputted 5 seconds. Alright, one thing I should mention going forward about time inside of Premiere is that it works differently than After Effects time. Premiere time actually uses something called seconds and ticks as a very specific object for time that has seconds, which is just represented by how many seconds there are, and ticks, which is a bizarre string that is somehow converted into seconds. The ticks don't actually make sense, but we'll actually be using them later in a very interesting way. So next up, let's just do some more housekeeping. We need to set a variable up for our project. Although this script is already kind of limited, a further limitation is that we need to have an empty project already open. I'm sure there's a way to just launch Premiere or create a new project from scratch once they launch it, but for now this is just the easiest way to do it. So we're going to say var project is equal to app.project. This is pretty conventional extend script code right here. And now we actually need to reference the project inside of this panel here. So inside of Premiere we can have multiple projects open at once, and they can all appear inside of this sort of project individual panel here. we need to reference not just the project we have open up here, but the one down here, because the one that's down here is going to contain all of our imported media and folders, etc. So what this is going to be called is just a project item, and we'll set this equal to our project that we just set up and the root item, which just references our project here and sort of the root project panel here, which is going to contain, again, all of our images, anything we import. After that, we can actually import our files with the built-in function. So I'm going to call our project and say import files, and the files we want to import are just going to be our image files array. We very specifically set up this array to be this format so that it would work with this import files method here. This method takes in an array of basically paths to your files and it will import them. One note is with this import files method, I would be careful. When running loops around it, it can mess it up a little bit. Because it takes longer to import the files than to run some of the loops, there's some asynchronicity, which means that not everything is going to run at the same time, and sometimes it might catch an error because one process that is after this import files already finished. So try and keep for loops or any other memory intensive things away from the import files method. Just a quick tip there. Alright, so next let's go ahead and set up our media inside of our imported path here. So let's first create a folder for our images. So we'll say var image folder, and we'll set this equal to our project item, which is the root item again. And for this, we're going to just say create bin. And a bin is just a British word for trash can. So inside of the create bin method, the only argument it requires is a name. So we'll just say image folder, and of course you can name this whatever you want. And after that, we want to create a sequence for all of our images. So we'll just say var, we'll call it the slideshow sequence. We'll set this equal to our project, and we're going to create a new sequence. It simply requires the name and the ID. The ID is simply just a bunch of unique characters or numbers for each layer or project item inside of Premiere. So I'm just going to arbitrarily put XXX. Alright, so let's go ahead and run this and make sure that everything is running smoothly. So I'll go ahead and select my folder, click on OK, 5 seconds, and as you can see our files have been imported, and now we can go ahead and select our sequence options, and that's looking pretty good. The next step is to move all of our images into this folder and also to add them into the timeline and obviously move them and start applying our slideshow effects. So after we've created our slideshow sequence, what I'm going to do is create a variable called imported images. Now this might ring a bell. We had imported files and image files that referenced files on our system level. Now we've imported these files and we've kind of lost track of them. We can't reference the path in my desktop backgrounds folder again to get these files. They're now inside of this project panel. So I need to go through the project panel and just like before, check if they're images. So our imported images, which is going to be representative of all of these images here, is going to be equal to get image project items. And we're just going to pass through our project item, which is basically our project. Now this is a custom function that we're going to set up right below here, and it's going to be very, very similar to the get images paths function. This time we're just going to be searching inside of Premiere for our data instead of on the system level. So again, the argument we're going to pass through here is going to be called project item. And just like the previous one, we're going to make a this name variable for the current project item name. And we'll also have an array for all of our project images. And then we'll set up a for loop starting at 0 and incrementing by 1 up until our project item.children and the num of items inside of the children. So inside of our current project item here, our PR script test project item, all of the children are simply all of the elements that have been imported, created, or added inside of here. So going through here each time, we're going to set this name equal to our project item and the current child and its name. Then, just like before, we're going to check if it's an image file. So I'm going to grab just the same code, because it's literally the exact same code we need, and paste it here. Then we're going to say if it's an image, we're going to grab our project images array and push our project item and the current child. Then once we're done with all of this, we need to return our project images. Alright, so now let's go ahead and make sure we're getting all of those project images right. Imported images, we'll write that down. And we'll run this really quick. Select the seconds, select the sequence, and now we have a list of project items which corresponds with everything we've imported. Alright, so now we've imported everything. Pretty much from here on out, everything is going to be self-contained inside of Premiere, and we won't be accessing any outside places. So after we've located the images we've imported, we now need to get familiar with our sequence. We need to go a couple levels down in that we need to get to our sequence, all of the video and audio tracks, and then we need to locate the video and or audio tracks that we're going to be using for this slideshow. For simplicity's sake, we're going to just be using one video track and no audio tracks. But the things we'll be learning here in a second will apply to any number. So the first thing we'll do is set up a variable called video tracks, and this is going to be an array of all of our video tracks. So the way to grab all those is to grab a sequence and just call the video tracks. I believe there's also one for audio tracks. So if you go to the sequence, yes, you can say .audio tracks as well. You can also get things like transitions later on. So now we have our video tracks. We just need to get track 1, where we're going to be adding all of the images. So I'll call var video track 1 is equal to all of our video tracks, which remember we just got. So I'll call our video tracks array and grab the very first value, which is going to be track 1. Now we're going to do a couple of small things that will benefit us later. The first of which is to define how long a frame is in the current sequence. What I mean by this is if I wanted to tell Premiere to make an image 1 frame long, what value do I give it? Do I give it 1? Well, no, because that would be seconds. Well, because Premiere uses an interesting time object with seconds and ticks as their properties, we can go ahead and find a way to do this. So the reason we need to get a frame length is when we're importing these and stacking them next to each other like this, they're going to be 1 frame off of each other, so we need to get the frame length to line them up better. So I'm going to create a variable called frame length, and if you're experienced in After Effects scripting, then the frame length is going to be basically equivalent to the frame duration. So if we had 30 frames per second, it would be 0.03 repeating, which is just the reciprocal of the frame rate. So 1 over 30, which would give us the frame duration. We're trying to get this number because that's what Premiere needs. So to do this, we'll just grab our time.seconds. Now we haven't set up the time because time objects are something we're going to go over in just a second. Then I'm also going to set a start time and set this equal to 0. What this is going to be doing is each time we go through and add an image, we'll add however many seconds, say 5, to the start time. So then the start time will be 5. The next image will start at 5 seconds. Add 5 more to the start time. So now we're at 10. Add the next image and start it at 10. Alright, so now let's go ahead and create a time so we can get our frame length. To do this, we'll simply create a variable called time and set it equal to a new time. This is just constructing a new time object for us. And then we can either say time.seconds or time.ticks to set up the value for the time. So if I wanted to, I could say time.seconds is equal to 1. Then it's automatically going to convert the 1 second into however many ticks that is for this particular sequence. So basically, it will automatically convert the other type for us, which is super useful. We don't actually want to use seconds, we want to use ticks, because we're going to set this equal to our current sequence, so our slideshow sequence. We want to grab the time base and convert that to a string. What this means is it's going to grab the time base. Well, if we look up what time base is inside of our sequence here, The time base basically is going to return a ticks amount of how long the time is. So what this means is once we push this into ticks, the seconds we're going to get is accurate. So this is going to give us how many ticks one frame is, and we're going to convert it using simply seconds here. To illustrate how this works, I'll alert time.ticks and time.seconds. Then I'll run it, select my folder, and this is how many ticks it is, roughly about 8 billion ticks, and then we now get the frame duration. So ticks is a weird number. It doesn't have anything to do with how many milliseconds it is or anything. It's just a string that somehow gets converted to actual seconds. So now we have the proper frame length, and we've now set up our start time. Now what we can do is go ahead and move all of our images we've imported into our image folder. So what we'll do is just do a for loop here. And since we've already created a for loop in here, we'll just use E for safety. And we'll go ahead and use E this time instead of I just to mix it up a bit. We'll start at E equals 0, and we'll increment by 1 until we get to imported images.length. So we've imported all of our images, identified them in the project. Now we're going to go through each one of those. For each one of those, there's a couple things we want to do. Inside of this for loop, we're going to do more than just move them into the folder, just so we can save processing speed. So the first thing we're going to do is grab our imported images E, and anytime we reference this, again, it's going to be equal to the current image that we've imported. So if we have 5 images, it's going to go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 through each image. So then we're going to say .movebin, and we're going to move it to our image folder. So we're going to take our current image we've imported and simply move it to our image folder. Easy as that. Then we're going to grab our imported image that we're working on, and we're going to say set scale to frame size. This is a super neat built-in function that they should add to After Effects scripting that will automatically scale your image layer or video layer to be the size of your sequence. Next up, let's go ahead and add our video to the track. So I'm going to grab our video track 1, and I'm going to grab the method called insert clip. Inside of insert clip, all we need to say is what we want to insert. So imported images E, our current image, let's insert it, and then we set the start time, which start time, we have a variable for it starting at 0. And now we need to change the start time so that next time we go through, it's not starting at 0 again. So all we need to do is increment it by what we set up earlier. So I'll say start time plus equals our seconds. So it's going to be equal to start time plus seconds, so it'd be 0, 5, 10, etc. We also want to add frame length. To illustrate why, let's go ahead and run this really quick. Just to be safe, I'm going to say parse int seconds, because when the user inputs the seconds, it could come across as text. So I'll select my image here, click on OK, and now we've successfully moved everything inside of our image folder here. We've automatically set the scale so it won't go too small or too big. And if we zoom in here, you can see everything is nearly perfectly aligned. You can see it looks like one frame off, which is what I was talking about earlier and why we need to use frame length. So if I say plus frame length, and just to be safe, I also want to set up the ending for these, because let's say I run this and don't do 5 seconds. What if I did 11 seconds? What's going to happen? I say 11 seconds. Click on OK, you can see we're going to have a problem. They're still only 5 seconds long, which is the default length for an image in Premiere. So what we need to do is change the ending as well of these. So below the start time, after we've changed the start time, I'm going to grab video track 1, and I'm going to grab all of the clips. So all the clips on video track 1, and I'm going to go through the current clip we're on, which is basically the clip we just inserted. We're going to grab the end of that and set it equal to our video track 1, same place, clip E, same clip. We're going to grab the start, the seconds, and add parse int seconds. This might seem convoluted, but it's rather simple. We're going to say go through each image here. The first image right here, we've just imported it, added it here. We're going to set the end to be the start of this clip plus the number of seconds the user put, which, say if they put 11, would be 0 plus 11. So we're going to end it right here. Simple as that. Alright, so now that we've imported all of these into our sequence here and moved them around, the next step is to now identify everything on here, just like we did when we imported our images. They're now inside of the sequence and we need to find them again. So I'm going to create a variable called our track items and set this equal to get track clips video track 1 as the argument. So inside of the get track clips function, we'll go ahead and set it up just below here. And we'll bring in our argument, just call it video track, which is going to be video track 1. Inside of here, we're going to set up a variable called clips, which is going to be equivalent to all of the clips on video track 1. So everything we've added here. Then we're simply going to loop through all of our clips. So var I is equal to 0. And we're going to go up till video track.clips and the number of items in clips. Then we'll just grab our clips and push video track.clips I, and then finally return clips. This is super simple. It's just going to run through our first video track here and give us all of the images or all of the items that are on the track. Alrighty, so now let's set up the last bit of main code here. It's going to go a little bit deeper than that, but it's just a simple for loop that's going to do the rest of the things for us. So we're going to set up a for loop with var I is equal to 0. And we're going to loop through our track items.length. Again, our track items are just everything in video track 1. So it's going to go through image here, 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 etc. The first thing we're going to do is set up a variable called components. And we're going to set this equal to track items I, or the current track item or image, and its components. Now components are a relatively undocumented thing in Premiere scripting. If we go into the object model viewer, they do exist. We can grab components and it returns a component collection. But there is no document or no good documentation for what components are. Components are basically these plugin type effects inside of the effect controls. So we have one called motion and opacity and time remapping as well. This would also be any other effects that you would add, like a blur or color correction. So we're going to be grabbing all the components, which should give us motion and opacity. Then we can go in individually and check out some of these values like rotation and scale. If you've made it this far into the tutorial, I suggest taking a small break as we're about to get rather technical and proprietary. So after we've done our components, we've gotten all of our components, motion and opacity. What we need to do is set up a custom video component object. I'll create a var called video component objects. And we'll set this equal to get component objects, and we'll pass through our current components. I'm going to add a comment above here because the first index is going to be our motion object and the second is our opacity object. Essentially, our motion object is going to be the motion component with a property for each of these. So we'll have motion object.position, motion object.scale, etc. And same for opacity, except we're just going to have opacity object.opacity. We're going to be using this custom object in a second to set all of our keyframes and values. So let's go ahead and define this function here. Say function get component objects, and we'll bring in our components. Now inside of here, we're going to set up a couple of initial variables, one called our opacity components, and one called the motion component. Then I'll set up two objects as well. First one is going to be our motion object, which we'll set to be empty, and we can add properties to this later. Then let's go ahead and loop through our components. Let's assume that in some versions of Premiere, opacity is before motion. So let's just run through all of our components and manually check which is which. So I'll say var I is equal to 0, and I is less than our components.num items. So go through as many components as we have, and each time we go through, let's check. Is the current components.displayName equal to opacity. And we'll also check if our current display name is motion. The display name is basically this name right here. So we're going to check, is it opacity or is it motion? Well, if it's opacity, we want to say opacity component is equal to the current component. And we'll also say if it's motion, then our motion component is equal to the current component. Alright, so now we've got the main components. Now we can go through these components and check for the individual properties. So below here, I'll now set up my opacity object. So I'll say opacity object is equal to a new object, and we're going to now define opacity object.opacity is going to be equal to our opacity component properties 0. What this means is we're going to look at our opacity component and grab the very first value, which is opacity. If we were to grab the very first value of motion, it would give us position. So we're just storing the value, not the value itself, but like the holder for the value. Alright, now we just need to loop through our motion component and check each one of them. Again, we're going to assume that in some versions of Premiere, scale comes before position or they're in a different order. So let's do it manually. Say var e is equal to 0. For e is less than our motion component properties.num items. So we're going to go through all of the properties, position, scale, etc. And then we'll increment e by 1. Now we're just going to set up a switch statement to check the display name of the current property. So I'm going to say switch our motion component, and I'm going to grab all of our properties, grab the current property, and grab the display name. Again, the display name is just going to be things like position, scale, rotation. So the first case is going to be position, and I'll break. And then we have scale, and you can go on through and do as many of these as you find necessary. In my case, I don't really have to do all of these. Originally, I didn't think I could automatically scale image layers, so I was going to get the scale values and develop an algorithm to do it for me. But in this case, I'm just going to do them so that you can see how it works. And then the final case would be anchor point. Now inside of each of these, I'm just going to define the properties for our motion object. So for if it's position, our motion object, and we'll create a property called position, and we'll set that equal to our motion component. And again, all of our properties, the current property. I'll go ahead and copy and paste this into our other sections here. And we'll just change it so that we have scale, scale width, rotation, and anchor point. Alright, so now that we have all of that, we'll get out of the for loop and the switch statement, and we'll say motion object.scaleCheck.set value. And in this case, we're simply going to return two things, because remember we have our motion object and our opacity object. So I'm literally just going to copy that, paste it there. So now we should have our objects calculated. We should now have each time through our video component objects, which have our motion and opacity objects. Alright guys, we're nearly done with the tutorial. We just have a few things to do left. That includes getting the values of some of these properties and setting up keyframes. So after we've gotten our video component object, now let's go ahead and set up some opacity parameters. So I'll say opacity param, because inside of Premiere, each of these inside of the component is called a component parameter. So position is a parameter, scale is a parameter, etc. So I'll say opacity param is equal to our video component objects, index 1, which is our opacity object, and we'll grab the property called opacity because that's the only one it has. Then we'll call a function called fade opacity, which we're going to set up here in a minute. It's going to take a couple of variables. So fade opacity. The first argument it's going to take is going to be the parameter, which is our opacity parameter. Then we're going to have the length of the transition, so like 1 second from 0 to 100% opacity, for example. We'll have the current image and the seconds. So on the other side, our inputs are going to be opacity param that we just set up, 1 second. So we want it to fade over 1 second. For our image, we're going to grab our track items, E or I for our current item. And then for our seconds, parse into seconds just to make sure it's a number. Inside of our fade opacity function, I'm going to grab our opacity parameter and say set time varying equal to true. What this means is we're basically going to tell it, make sure the stopwatch is on, and we want to make sure that we can keyframe this value. After that, we're going to grab our param and say add key. We're actually going to do this 4 times. We want 2 at the beginning and 2 at the end. So inside of add key, we simply need to put in the time we want the keyframe to occur. Now this part can get people thrown off a little bit. I've seen a lot of people say that you cannot add keyframes because they actually don't know how time works in Premiere properly. Earlier we talked about how there are ticks and seconds. Each are very different, but they are relatable. There's also different times in different references. So for example, the time in our slideshow sequence might be different from the start time of our image here. So if we want to add a keyframe, say here, are we supposed to say add a keyframe at 31 seconds, or do we want to add a keyframe at 0 seconds because that's where this clip starts? So it can be a little bit confusing. And you also want to make sure you're applying time in seconds so it doesn't apply some crazy number. Sometimes I've applied the keyframe to ticks, and the keyframe adds it to like 3,000 seconds later. So just note to yourself, make sure you're putting in the right time. If we add our keyframes and you're not seeing them anywhere in here, it's likely you're using the wrong time. So the first keyframe we're going to add is at the very first time. So we're going to take our image and grab its endpoint in seconds. This is going to be a surefire way, no matter what, to make sure that the endpoint doesn't go any further left than this. There's going to be a keyframe right there. The next keyframe we want to be 1 second after that. So we're going to grab our image.endpoint.seconds plus length. And again, our length is set to 1 second. Then I can just copy and paste this. Instead of endpoint, we'll say outpoint. Actually, we can say endpoint still and say the seconds, but this time we'll say plus seconds minus length. This way we go forward 11 seconds if it's 11 seconds, and then minus a second. And then finally, for the last keyframe, we'll say endpoint.seconds plus seconds. Now let's go ahead and run this and make sure our keyframes are being applied. I accidentally added a semicolon inside of our object. Let's try it again. Need to add a colon there. Alright, so now if we go ahead and run the script, select our folder, say 11 seconds, and click on OK. Now if we go ahead and click on one of our images here, you can see we now have our opacity keyframes. They're not set to anything yet, but we have our keyframes so it will fade in and fade out. So below inside of our fade opacity function, we have a couple more things to add, and that's simply to set the values. So just like before, I'm going to call param 4 times, and this time I'm going to say set value at key. Now this will take 2 parameters. The first one is the time, so I'll say the same time as the previous keyframe. In fact, I'll just do this. So we have all of the same times. This time we want to set the values. The first keyframe we want to be 0. Set it to 0 opacity, and we want it to go up to 100. Then the third keyframe we want to stay at 100, and then go back down to 0 as we get to the last one. So now if I go ahead and run it, we're now going to have a nice fade on the beginning and end of our clips. Alright, now let's head back up a level. We'll head back into our main function below fade opacity. So below fade opacity, what we're going to do is go ahead and animate our scale. So I'll call a function called animate scale, and inside of this we're going to pass a couple of values very similar to previous. So below here again I'll define animate scale, and our arguments for animate scale are going to be param for parameter, the length of our transition if we need it, which in this case we won't, but we'll bring it in anyway, the image, the scale, and the seconds. Now, to get the scale value, we're actually going to go through and read all of our values and get them here. We're not going to use all the values, but we're going to get them so that we can use them later if we need. So back up here above our animate scale, we're going to set up our last stuff here. So we're going to set up position value, scale height, scale width, and anchor point value. We're just going to grab all the values from these components so we can have them as reference. So I'm going to grab video component objects 0, which references our motion object, which has all of this. And inside of our motion object, we'll grab our position, and we're going to call the function getValue, which will simply return whatever value it has. In position's case, it has 960 by 540, but it's actually not going to return that. If I was to say alert the position, we're actually going to get 0.5 and 0.5. I'll explain why in just a moment. First, let's go ahead and grab our other values here. I'll say instead of position, we'll get scale. And then for this one, I'll add scale width. And for anchor point, it will be the same thing. Now, let's go ahead and alert our position value and see if we get 0.5 by 0.5 as our position. It seems weird, but let's see. Correct, we're getting 0.5 by 0.5 for our position value. Let's take a look at why this is. Well, to be honest, there isn't really a reason why, but 0.5 is sort of the scalar. 0.5 is representative of half of the sequence size. The position is in relation to our sequence, which is 1920 by 1080. Position is just half of that. Half of 1920 is 960, half of 1080 is 540. So we have to sort of use these weird half values for this. And it gets weirder. For anchor point, it references the size of our layer. So this is actually half of the size of our layer, which would be 2048 by approximately, but it would actually return the same value, 0.5 by 0.5. You need to be wary of this because it can be tricky to set the values appropriately sometimes. For things like opacity, it's really easy, but for other values that have 2 dimensions, it can get a little bit tricky. So just remember that and you'll have no problems. So to pass through some things through animate scale here, let's go ahead and grab our video component objects, index 0, so our motion object, and the property scale. That's our parameter. Then our length is 1. Our image is track items I. Our scale is our scale height. And lastly, our seconds is just going to be parse int and seconds. Now inside of animate scale, let's finish off our script. First things first, we need to make sure our parameter has the time varying so we can set keyframes. So set time varying needs to be true. Then we're just going to set up 2 keyframes, one at the beginning and one at the end for scale. We don't want anything too fancy here. So I'm going to grab my parameter and set 2 keys. The first of which is referencing our image's endpoint in seconds. And the second one is the image endpoint in seconds plus the seconds the user inputted, which will just basically be the end of the clip. Then just like before, instead of add key, we're going to set value at key, which will allow us to set these actual keyframe values. The seconds are the same, but the values are going to be different. The reason we grabbed scale is because there's no way to backwards engineer, say, the anchor point. If we were to say, what's the value of the anchor point? We're not going to get 1024 by 682. We're going to get 0.5 by 0.5. So we can't actually check the size of our layer. To get around this, we're going to use the 0.5 values and just multiply them by a sort of multiplier. So I'm going to grab our scale as our original value. It's going to start at size scale, 0.5 by 0.5. And then we're going to grab our scale times 1.1, which will multiply our scale by 10%, making it roughly 0.6 or 0.7 instead of the 0.5 by default. Alright, so assuming this is working, the script should be complete. Let's have a look. Go to our folders here, select my backgrounds, say 7 seconds per image, and it looks like we added this in the wrong place. And we'll run it again. This time we'll try 4 seconds. And now we should have a working slideshow. As you can see, we have all of our keyframes for scale and opacity. All of our layers are nicely aligned. You can see some of them are a little bit off, but this doesn't matter as we're fading things in and out. Alright guys, that's going to do it for this week's tutorial. I hope you enjoyed. I know this was a very long tutorial. I might even split it up into multiple parts, but I'm not sure. If you have any further questions or comments regarding scripting of any kind for Adobe programs, feel free to leave them down below, as well as any future suggestions for tutorials you have. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a thumbs up and subscribe for more weekly tutorials. Don't forget new tutorials every Monday and Thursday at noon Mountain Standard Time. Thanks again guys for watching, and we will see you next time.